I want to welcome everyone to the Understanding Suicide and Substance Misuse Among Urban Native Youth virtual learning session. Mindy, could you go to the next slide, please? This is our first session in our new Promoting Mental Wellness Community of Learning series. This series is focused on providing ways to support and enhance the mental wellness of our youth and young adult community members, especially during these difficult times. We have two more sessions in the series, one that focused specifically on telebehavioral health services, and a third that focuses on a strength-based approach to addressing stress. Next slide. My name is Emily Baer. I'm Malice of the Holton Band in Maine, and I currently serve as a public health associate in the Technical Assistance Department here at NCUIH. Next slide. Many of you are probably very familiar with NCUIH already and our mission. We are a national nonprofit organization devoted to the support and development of quality, accessible, and culturally competent health and public health services for American Indians and Alaska Natives living in urban areas. We are the only national representative of the 41 Title V Urban or Indian Organizations, or UIOs, under the Indian Health Service in the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. Here at NCUIH, we strive to improve the health of the over 70% of the American Indian Alaska Native population that lives in urban areas. Next slide. This is the agenda for today, and you should have received this in your registration form as well. We are going to start off with some general housekeeping guidelines and Zoom etiquette before we move into the presentation. We will have time for a brief Q&A following the presentation, and we also want to welcome anyone who would like to stay for a longer open discussion following the end of the event. Next slide. So for housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. All mics are muted on entry unless we invite you to unmute to ask a question or comment. Please turn your camera on. It does allow for kind of a better interaction. And this is a 1-hour session with an open discussion following. Questions can be typed into the chat box, and we will have this Q&A session at the end of the session. Following the presentation, we always make our slides and recordings available at our landing page, which is ncuih.org/SUNY, but you'll also receive a follow-up email with all the materials and resources mentioned. We do have an evaluation link following the end of the session that I'm going to put in the chat box for now, so you can, if you want, open it and save it for later, and just complete it when you have the time following the session. I'll put that in the chat box shortly. Next slide. If you're less familiar with the Zoom platform, an easy way to ask a question or comment and to interact with our presenters is to first select the chat button at the bottom of your Zoom screen in the center, and then you can just type your question or comment into the chat box, and it will appear on the right, and we will be monitoring the chat box during this presentation. Next slide. We do have several polling events during the presentation, and we appreciate any of your feedback and participation during these. For our polling questions, you can just select the answer when it appears onto your screen and select submit before we show the results. Next slide. I'm very excited to introduce Kelley McCall to you as our guest presenter today. Kelley is a third-year MSW and PH dual degree student and a member of the Cherokee Nation. She graduated with a BA in psychology from the University of New Mexico. And as a dual degree student, she hopes to implement traditional programs and intervention strategies within the current medical institutions and tribal communities. Currently, Kelley is a student intern for NCUIH, and she plans upon graduation to continue on to a PhD in social work with the goal of becoming a tenured professor. We are very excited to welcome Kelley to our presentation, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to her today.
Great, thanks, Emily, for that wonderful introduction. I do want to begin with respectfully acknowledging the ancestral lands of the Osage and Illini that I am on during this presentation. So during this presentation, we will be talking about substance use and suicidal behaviors. So I want to offer a trigger warning for all of the participants today to let them know that we will be going into depth on these two topics. So with that, we're going to dive right in with some statistics. So next slide, please. And we'll begin with alcohol use disorder among Native Americans. Next. So as you can see here, the age spikes around 18 to 25 years for those AINs with alcohol use disorder. And keep in mind, this is diagnosed as a disorder. This isn't just alcohol use. So this provides an opportunity to intervene at lower levels, like grade school levels, middle school levels, so we can get to, we can address this spike before it happens. And I want to note that these numbers are declining. So it's important to see what's working. Obviously, what we're implementing, what we're doing within American Indian, Alaska Native communities is working. So I like to always focus on strengths as well. So I do want to note that as well. And next slide, please. This slide discusses alcohol initiates, so basically when alcohol use begins. And as you can notice, that starts between 12 and 17, which is very common among my family. And so I think that this is interesting that we can address these issues. Usually it's around adverse childhood experiences. Those tend to be big contributors to substance use and suicidal behaviors. If you're not familiar with those, they are basically negative impacts to children. So if you have parental substance use or incarceration or emotional, psychological, sexual abuse, those type of deals are under the ACEs umbrella. But I do want you to notice that there is less initiate abuse from the overall population. So we're at around 5.5, where the overall population is at 10. And again, we don't have a lot of data going older, but with the 12 to 17 range, it has decreased considerably within the last 2017 to 2018 year. And these data are collected from the NASDA 2018 surveys created by SAMHSA. So that's a little bit about alcohol use. So now we will, next slide, please. We'll go on to substance use disorder among AINs. And for this, if we can go to the next slide, we're looking at those 12 and over, ages 12 and over. And this does say illicit drug use, although I am interested in knowing, because marijuana is such a, it's way over all the other like psychotherapeutic drugs, such as like opioids, opiates. And if you'll look at the overall population, you're looking at around 16%, whereas our population is around 23. My question is, what if marijuana is being used for medicinal purposes? There's a lot of high risk health disparities within Indian country, within AIN individuals. So to me, this might not be, it is obviously an issue, but it might not be as big as it looks on this slide, because it could be used for medicinal purposes as well. So I think that that needs to be considered when you are looking at these data. There might be some context built in around it. Next slide, please. So if you look at this, Native Americans on reservations are 3.5 times more likely than overall US students to have alcohol and marijuana use disorder. So you're looking at this 4 out of 10, 4+ out of 10, so that's almost half. And this is, of course, students. And then if you go back to the NASDA data, you're looking at 1 in 5 Native American young adults between around 18 and 25, they have substance use disorder. So this is showing when you're talking about almost half of the population using alcohol and marijuana, that definitely needs to be addressed as well. So next slide, please. Here is just a few risk factors for substance abuse in Native American communities. These are just overall risk factors. You're looking at low school completion rates, which in turn goes to high unemployment rates, undeveloped support systems. So that goes back to what I was talking about adverse childhood experiences, high rates of historical trauma and loss. We know that that's intergenerational. So that's it keeps getting passed down from generation to generation. And of course, normative rates by peers, you get that additional peer pressure. If your peers are using substances, you're more likely to do that as well. So next slide, please. Now I'm going to go into a little bit more of specifics between urban and rural risk factors. Keep in mind, these are not mutually exclusive. So they can transfer, some in rural, some in urban. They're not mutually exclusive. This is just a little snapshot here a little bit. So some urban factors are fewer native resources. I know where I'm from in New Mexico, there's maybe a couple, 1 or 2 cultural centers in the metropolitan area of Albuquerque. Access to tribal services. This could happen with Indian healthcare services facilities. I know that in St. Louis, where I'm currently at, I have to travel 4 hours to Kansas City to be able to access Indian health services. And that's not always feasible. So you have limited access to that. Political processes, you do have to follow federal, state, government guidelines as far as healthcare, things of that nature, laws. Sustaining cultural resources, cultural knowledge. I know as an urban Native woman, I was separated from that a little bit more than my cousins who did live out on reservations. So, and these can also be not just for substance use, but suicidal behaviors as well. So risk factors are risk factors. If you want to go to the next slide, please. Some rural, you have social isolation. There's not much to do out there. There's not museums on reservations or zoos or nearly as many like parks as far as like entertainment parks, concerts, things like that. So you're a little bit more isolated in rural areas. Short of health care. I know that when my uncle had a stroke out on the Zuni res, he ended up having to get airlifted to the University of New Mexico hospital, which was like an 1.5 hours away. And so I know that if something of that nature happens, and he had to be lifted away from the reservation. There are higher unemployment and poverty rates. And of course you have transportation issues. And there's also a lack of anonymity as far as seeking help for substance use and suicide ideations that we'll talk a little bit about when I go into some of the prevention strategies. But those are just a few factors. And again, they're not mutually exclusive. You might have some, you might not. Every area is different, but those are just a few. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Now we'll be talking about suicide risk. The American Indian Foundation for Suicide Prevention estimated that young people account for 40% of suicides in Indian country. I'll say that again. Young people account for 40% of suicides in Indian country. That's a problem. So with that being said, we'll talk a little bit about statistics and why that is. So next slide, please. Here we have a slide around suicidal thoughts, plans, and attempts. Suicidal thoughts have doubled from 2008, but they are around equal for the overall population. We don't know the distinction between 2008 and 18 for suicidal plans, but American Indians, Alaska Natives are double from the overall United States population. And we are over double the overall population in suicidal attempts. And this is for ages 18 to 25. So we don't even have the data from 12 to 17 and things of that nature. Next slide, please. We're gonna see co-occurring. So once you introduce substance use disorder in with suicidal thoughts, ideations, attempts, if you can see on this slide, they quadruple in numbers. So this is huge. I mean, for plans and attempts, once you introduce substance, the numbers just skyrocket. And this is what got me into what I do. I will share a little bit of insight into my personal history. And I had an older brother, and his name was Scott. And at 36, he had a substance use disorder. He was using multiple drugs, polysubstances. And one night he was high on cocaine, on marijuana, and he had been drinking for 12 hours straight. And he ended up shooting himself. And so when I got into my master's program as a non-traditional student and I started learning a little bit more about this, that fueled the fire as to why I do what I do. This is not a statistic to me. This is very, very personal. So that to me made me wonder what in our lives was missing. How come one of our cousins is thriving and the other one has passed away? So that's just a little bit about why I do what I do and why this is so important. So that being said, I do believe that there is hope, and I do believe that there is room for destigmatization and for introducing culture into our communities. And another thing that has kept me going is having that strong sense of cultural identity. So for an example, my Cherokee name is a Gailey Ska, or a Gailey, and that means sunshine. And my great grandmother, since Cherokee, it's matriarchal. So you take the mother's clan, everything's matriarchal. The eldest mom or the eldest woman in the clan or in our clan gives the name. And for ours, it was my great grandmother. So she took me out one day as a baby, and she had this house in Stillwell, Oklahoma, down in the holler. There was creeks and forests. It was beautiful. So she took me out one day for the whole day and brought me back. And my mother, and she gave me to my mom and said, "This is a Gailey." And so when my mom asked why and what was the meaning, my great grandmother said that all through the creek and all through the forest, light kept shining on me. And I was so fair-skinned that it was blinding her. And so she decided I was bright as the sun. And so for me, as far as cultural identity goes, that's what I have always brought to the table. I want to bring that brightness into a room. And I always want to leave something better than I found it. So that's just a little bit about why I do this. And these are, yes, they're statistics. Yes, they're important for policy and to get major change done and to determine what works and what doesn't. But these are more than statistics to me. These are real. These are real problems that happen to real people. And so with that, I definitely want to start focusing on what has worked. So next slide, please. So we're going to go into what has worked, because there's hope. There's wonderful things that American Indians, Alaska Natives have. There's wonderful strengths that we have that can counterbalance all this. And I think at this point, Emily wanted to post the survey again in the chat, just for those that might have came in later and might have to leave. But now we're going to go into what has worked for us out in the communities. So if we can go next slide. First, I want to talk about what wellness is to me and to my Native community, to my family. We use the medicine wheel, which is a balance of mind, body, and spirit. And that is core to us of what wellness is. And then we branch out to family and home. And by these, I mean income, education, employment, working conditions, healthy childhood development, parenting. And then we branch out a little further to community. And for this, I talk about social support networks, healthcare services, like we talked about earlier, education. And then we branch out a little bit further to culture and land. For this, I'm talking about traditions, about ceremony, harvesting, planting, the state of our air and our water, the climate, food systems. All of that is come together, and all of that needs to be as balanced as possible for wellness. And so I think that's important to recognize when we talk about how do we build wellness in our youth? How do we build them in our young adults? And even going further, both directions, generational, 7 behind, 7 ahead. I think that that's important to recognize. So next slide, please. So here we're gonna, change the slide, I think, to Wellness Court. This is my experience that I had out on the Pueblo of Laguna. Do you guys see that slide, Mindy? Oops.
I think her internet has frozen. I'm sorry for the technical issues, everyone. It wouldn't be a successful presentation without one issue to overcome, right?
Exactly, exactly. It's the world we're living in. Oh. Well, I can continue talking about it and we can get back to the slides. I was out on the Pueblo of Laguna, which is about 40 minutes away from, it's west of Albuquerque. And I did get their permission to discuss this, and they also have a website out that has this for public viewing as well. But they have, this is regarding substance use among the people of Laguna. So they call it a wellness court, and it's similar to a drug court program in urban communities. And if you're not familiar with a drug court program, that is for those convicted for misdemeanors of drug possession, DWIs, misdemeanor related to substance use, they can get sentenced to drug court as opposed to jail. And it could be a year long, it could be a little longer, it could be shorter, but standard around a year. And it's very strict and very, almost in my opinion, punitive. And so I think, well, what happens is that you have random drug tests. You get called by number or color, and you go in and you have random drug tests. You have to go to AA or NA meetings. You have group therapy, individual therapy. You have coping classes like meditation and acupuncture. And all this, we're talking like every day of the week you're doing this. So if you have a job or you have family to care for, this makes it very difficult. It's almost like do the 3 days and get out, that type of deal. So that's a little bit about the drug court. You can't leave the county, you can't leave anywhere. So it's very strict. If you do test dirty, if you do miss a test or you miss classes, then that you go directly to jail. Sometimes they might give you community service, like picking up trash, things of that nature, but usually you go directly to jail. So that being said, the wellness court of the Pueblo of Laguna is a little bit different. And to me, it's not punitive. It's really about helping the individual grow and succeed and not so much punish. Definitely holds them accountable, but is not punitive. You still have to go to NA, AA sessions. You still have individual counseling. You have random drug testing. You have weekly check-ins with the judge. And there's one judge for the whole community. So he knows you on a personal level. It's not just some random person going into a courtroom that he sees, 900 people every day. So there is one judge that knows you. You are permitted to leave the reservation if you have work, if you are on the powwow circuit, if you can't go beyond the state, but you do get a little bit of leniency for a couple days. You'd have to check in and of course test when you get back, but you're allowed. They're not going to take away those strengths, your passion for that. And the community service is determined by the community. If it's harvesting season, you're going to go out and harvest. If it's planting season, you're digging. And that's determined by the community. So that to me is important because it encompasses culture. They're trying to build those strengths as opposed to just punish, take away, things of that nature. And everyone that I saw during my time there that was set to graduate, graduated. And not only did they graduate, but they had started being involved in their culture. They had started pottery making or beading, or they themselves had gone back to school to be counselors, all of that. And so it wasn't just, yay, I graduated the program. It's now, what can I do to better myself and the community? So that was very successful in my book. And it was quite different than what I had experienced with urbanized drug courts. So I think that can take, that could be important for maybe reframing urbanized drug courts, maybe start incorporating a little bit of culture, a little bit of self-growth and self-identity. Not to say that they're bad. Drug courts can be very successful. In fact, I believe they are very successful, like 90% graduate. So that's a little bit about that, that experience that I had with a successful substance use intervention and program. So next slide, please. Next, I am going to talk about, it's called the New Hope Model. And this was developed by Dr. Mary Quick and her team out of Johns Hopkins. And this has been something that I have wanted to expand upon and really dig more into with the work, the research and stuff that I do, because I believe that this is awesome, the way this program was developed. So next slide, please. So she does define her suicide attempts as premeditated with a clear intent to take your life. And definitions tend to be important um, for reproduction of the interventions, making sure they don't just work for one tribe, but they can work for many. And American Indian, Alaska Native populations, it's big for data collection as well. So we can have like the statistics we had at the very beginning. You just have a clear-cut definition of that. So this was her definition that they used for their intervention of New Hope. Next slide, please. What they found with the White Mountain Apache was that they were 13 times higher risk than the US population, and 73% used substances during a suicide attempt. 73%, that's like 3 out of 4 people were using substances during their suicide attempt. And what I found interesting was the 60% of young moms, of young females. So that to me suggests maybe this, not only the stressors of puberty and hormones, but the pressures of child rearing, maybe the lack of coping and parenting skills, maybe that intergenerational trauma is being passed down from generation to generation. So that to me is a interesting statistic when discussing this. So did we lose the slides again?
I apologize, we're switching over so we can continue the presentation with a different host for now to make this a little easier, but we'll be right back on board in 1 sec.
Do you want me to pause or do you want me to keep going?
Do you want to pause for 1 minute, Kelley?
Absolutely. Anybody
Thank
need
you all.
a break or anything, we can kind of take a minute.
I was noted that Victoria Garcia has her hand up. Is it possible to maybe let Victoria type her question in the chat box or to unmute her so she might be able to ask a question?
Sure. Maybe type it in the chat. I don't have the power to unmute.
Oh, Victoria, Victoria said she did not notice that it was an accidental hand up. So, so thank you, Victoria, for your quick response.
Yes.
Thanks, Victoria. Sorry to call on you impromptu. No pressure.
Right. And I see one that's just right above it from Julio saying, is there a breakdown on the type of substances used during an attempt? I believe that there is, and the major one is alcohol. That is the majority. I don't have statistics directly in front of me. I do know that there are studies that have done that, and the majority is alcohol that is used during an attempt.
Okay, it looks like we're back online. So thank you for your patience as we get back to the right slide.
All right, up and rolling. Okay, so yeah, we were at that slide, at the statistics slide. Are we in presentation view? So statistics. Okay, so we discussed that substance uses were 3 out of 4 during a suicide attempt, and then the young mamas. And I did see in the chat before we pop back up that there's postpartum depression as well. That's an excellent point. Yes. So next slide, please. So now we'll talk a little bit about the New Hope model and what some of the components were for that. They advertised it through social media, radio, TV, all throughout the reservation. And what I thought was exciting and great was the support walks. Researchers can come in with grants and they have this money and they provide this prevention and then they leave, and then what? So with providing avenues and ideas of how to keep this sustainable, how to bring in funding to keep these programs sustainable is huge. You're not just coming in with your money and leaving. You're teaching and you're educating, and not only that, but you're creating sustainability for these programs. And so one of their ideas was to do like a support walk, like you do for Susan B. Komen diabetes walks. It was a support walk, and that I thought was a great idea to create a little bit of sustainability with the program. Now she did a great job of mixing Western with traditions. So you did have skill building, like coping skills, anger management, parenting skills, all of these essential skill building that are important for wellness. But there were also cultural activities that were brought in. And I had mentioned a few before, like pottery, beading, quilling, storytelling, all of these cultural activities, field trips for children to go out to sacred sites and learn about their history, learn about their identity, and how important that is. Like me being a Gailey, that really helps a lot when you're trying to figure out, what am I doing? What's going on? You have that base. And the key to, in my opinion, was the elder involvement. Elders came into these sessions in these rooms with these youth and shared stories of heritage, of their culture, of traditions. And not only that, but not everyone uses drugs. Not everybody has attempted or thought about suicide. So why? Let's bring those strengths to the table. Let's bring that in. How did they cope when they were sad, feeling overwhelmed? What changed that mindset for them? Because not everybody does drugs and not everybody has those suicidal ideations. So I think bringing those elders in and really having someone to look up to that you respect, that is known in your community, I think is important. And I think that was a key component for talking about rebuilding and getting that balance back with mind, body, and spirit. So those were just a few of the components that were done through this program. And next slide, please. It was very successful. So within 5 years, the suicide rates decreased by almost 40% in 5 years. So that's awesome. I mean, that's amazing. So that just shows how culture is important. If we can go to the next slide, please. So this is my favorite. Let's talk about some protective factors. Let's talk about what strengths we as Native people bring to the table. It just shows the value and the importance of culture to bring in when we're thinking about intervention and prevention strategies. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. We just want to make it a smoother ride. We want to enhance it, but we don't need to reinvent it. We just want to bring in that culture. And so some of these notable factors in the New Hope study was the sacred sites, learning where and how the tribes were celebrating and how they celebrated life and harvesting season and the land and the people and the community. Cultural activities were huge, learning drum making, learning how to dance, things of that nature. And then of course the elder involvement that I talked about. I think that having someone strong that's respected and important to look up to is very beneficial. And I think that it is important to note that even though these two models, the Wellness Court and the New Hope model, were conducted in rural communities, these can be translated to urban communities as well. Risk factors are risk factors. Protective factors are protective factors. It's just finding the resources and making sure that there's enough capacity to translate these from rural to urban communities and vice versa. A lot easier said than done, but we have to start somewhere. And at least knowing what has worked can help translate to what we can do better. And so I think it's important to notice that just because these were done in rural communities does not mean that they can't apply in urban communities as well. And it is up to all of us to identify what is needed so we can help build that capacity, so we can help reduce these numbers of suicide use and of suicidal ideations and behaviors. I think that's incredibly important. So before we go on to the final section of my presentation, I believe we're going to have some poll questions that we're going to pop up. So what are some protective factors that are present in your community that you currently live in? Feel free to check as many as you want. And then of course, if there's others, we'd love to hear about those and build upon those as well. So we'll give you a few minutes to go with this question. And we really do appreciate the feedback as well. Okay, maybe one more minute. We'll get on, and we have one more, and then we'll continue on.
And we also have a question in the chat box, so I just want to remind everyone that we do have lots of time set aside for Q&A, so don't worry, we are receiving your questions and we will get to them as soon as we can. Thank you.
Yeah, we'll get to those directly, and then also we will be staying after as well to continue that conversation if you would like, and if I'm happy to email and go further. I'll put my email in the box as well in the chat so that everybody has that information as well. Oops. All right, this is great feedback. Wonderful. Okay, should we go to the next poll question so we can?
Was everyone able to see the results? Okay, I'll share them quickly. It does look like we have, if anyone wants to unmute and share what their other protective factor is, feel free.
Yes.
Or type it into the chat box too, of course. Thanks, Tiffany. Tiffany said youth outreach and wraparound, which is a good point. Outreach and engagement. Yes. And we are going to move on with the presentation since the other polling question isn't accessible at the moment. Kelley, just so you're aware.
Okay. Blessing ceremonies, that's great as well. Awesome. I love it. Okay, so continuing on, no presentation would be complete without discussing COVID in this time of our world today. So I can tell you that there is not a lot of information available yet, but there is some. I believe that I was able to find at least a couple of interesting articles. So if we can go to the next slide, please. As far as substance misuse, we are included in the other race, which as a researcher drives me crazy. But I believe it's better than something else, which is what we were called a few months ago. But so we don't know specifically AINs from other races completely. But if you look at this in the other race, it's 11% to the overall 13%, which is about equal. And same with rural and urban areas. Those are pretty equal for substance misuse prevalence. What I find interesting is the unpaid caregivers for adults. We're looking at an almost 30% difference there, which I think is important. This is going to be a huge target area. And I think about my own communities and my own aunts and uncles, and that's what we've been doing our whole lives. We take care of our elders. We make sure that they get the best care that we can possibly give them. And we don't get paid. We don't care about that. At least my family, we don't. We do it. That's what you do. So now for statistics and data to start showing this, I think is important, because that can also be a target area. I was in a webinar recently about, they were talking about an incubation period. And that really stuck with me on what's going to happen next, what's happening now. So that's interesting to me. And if we go to the next slide, now we'll bring in the suicidal ideations. And again, other races pretty equal to the US overall, rural and urban areas. But again, the unpaid caregivers are around 30% higher. So to me, this is huge. And then of course, our essential workers. We've all determined that how important they are in our communities. And I think these are great, great data so that we know kind of what to target in the future as far as going forward. But again, there's not a lot of data yet on what's happening. So the next slide, please. And once again, ending on a positive note, this goes against what I thought, but substance misuse and suicidal thoughts are actually decreased from 2 years ago. That to me was very interesting statistic. I would have thought they would be completely the opposite. So that's awesome. And I'm wondering, I have a hypothesis that maybe it is because people now have had a little bit more time to learn new skills, learn to cook, relearn something that you've done in the past, like playing the piano or a musical instrument, or maybe learning some cultural activities, learning history, reading books. I'm wondering if that might have something to do with it as well. But again, we don't know. And so I'm excited to see if we can maybe draw on some of those strengths in the future. So with that, Wado, thank you so much for your time and your attention. And again, I've put my information in the chat. These will be available to you, to anyone who wishes to see them, the slides, and of course it's being recorded. So those are just a few references. And again, like Emily said, we will be sticking around, but for now I'm willing to answer questions or even just be here for a decompression session if anybody wants to share or have any concerns. But thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Kelley?
Yes.
Thank you so much for doing this. This is very important, and especially during these times. But my main concern at this point, and I believe you said at the beginning, Emily, that we will be sent the PowerPoints.
I'll make those available. Yeah. feel free. Mhm.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yes, that's
We
correct. And the
registered
record.
We registered with our emails. So that would be great to be able to get this data and to be able to share it and spread it and keep it going.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, if we just go to the next slide quickly. I just wanted to invite everyone to share your thoughts and feedback on this presentation. We really appreciate you sharing your experience with us, Kelley. And I know how much work you put into also developing the content, doing all of the research, and putting it together for our audience. And I know how much thought and care you put into this. I really, truly appreciate it.
Okay, Sarah.
I just wanted to put the survey link in the chat quickly to invite anyone if they have other topics they want to see in the future, other discussions that NCUIH can help facilitate and start. So please
So
do
were you
fill that
taking a
out
half
if
an
you have
hour lunch
time.
before? So you want to do an hour?
And if we go to the next slide, we do have a couple events also upcoming. We have our second mental wellness series, like I mentioned earlier, on clinical telebehavioral health. And then we also have an accreditation series coming up. This first session on the 25th of February is just an overview of AAAHC, the Joint Commission, CARF, and NCQA. So you can find the registration there. And we will be sending the PowerPoint slides, the recording, and a resource guide that Kelley helped to put together. She compiled a lot of resources and toolkits for everybody, so you're not walking away with just the slides. And with that said, I just wanted to say thank you again to everybody who joined, and if you want to stick around and please ask any questions that you have, or stay for the open discussion with us. We can go to that slide. Thank you. And I see we do have one question already to start us off from Dr. Mark Clark about the thought regarding the link between ideation, suicidal ideation, and planning. How is that different? And how do those elements link together?
Okay, great question. Usually ideations are just a brief fleeting thought. It'd be better if I just killed myself. Moving on. Planning, you've actually formed an actual plan. I have chosen this building. I have chosen this method to do. There's a big difference between ideation and planning. You never know. I would think, in my educated guess, that the thought would come before the plan. But as far as it would depend to me on the intensity of the thought, the frequency of the thoughts, the duration of the thoughts that would lead to actually creating a plan. So definitely understanding and getting to why these thoughts are even arising would be helpful in stopping the snowball effect, if you will. Did that answer your question?
Mark, did that answer your question?
Yes,
I
see.
I didn't realize I was unmuted. I was typing in the chat box. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I believe we had a question earlier about data.
Mhm.
So is there any data that reveals our relatives who are active in cultural events and or practices are less likely to have substance use disorder or self-harm thoughts? That was from Stan.
From the literature that I've read, yes. The more cultural involvement you have, the less likely you are to use substances. So I think that's why it's important to bring culture, and that's where these prevention strategies are coming about, is from these past interviews with communities about, yes, the more cultural involvement or the more history that they have of their tribe or their traditions, the less likely they are to engage in substance use. Now, they might use substances, but it won't necessarily lead to substance use disorder, which is more severe. So yes, it has been linked to be a protective factor.
Michael had a question as well. And Michael, you can unmute yourself if you want and ask it, or if you don't feel comfortable, I'm happy to ask it. When you mentioned a reduction in substance misuse between 2018 and 2020, Michael was asking about an increase in overdose occurrences due to fentanyl at this time in their area.
That's a fantastic question. That's why I was a little surprised at this statistic that I found that it was decreasing, because I was thinking it was, from what I've heard in other communities, that it has been increasing. And so overdoses, that's definitely a statistic that I think would be interesting to start learning about. But again, I think it's a little too early to start collecting data on all that. Unfortunately, it's a process. But I do agree with you. I know in my own communities, even in my own family whose reservations out on Zuni, they have had an increase as well. So I am curious, and it might depend on the areas that you're in as well. And of course, there's all kinds of context and social factors that you need to consider as well. But I have too. I've definitely heard of that, and so I'm very curious to know why that is as well. So that's a great question, and I thank you for bringing that up and bringing that to the attention of us. I think that's very important. Full blood, multi-tribal, or multiracial. No, that is interesting as well. I think that we're lucky to even get those that say that identify as AINs in the data collection, but I am incredibly curious about that myself. I do know, unless you're actually going from tribe to tribe to tribe, which is incredibly hard to do, that might be a little bit hard to research, but I think that that's also an excellent area to advance upon, because I do believe that trauma goes beyond statistics, just beyond how you identify. I think that goes back to your cultural identity as well. But yeah, and there are some that identify as more than one race. Those are separated a little bit. But for the purposes of this presentation, I just focused on those that solely identified as AIN. So I do know that there are some multiracial comparisons, but as far as the blood quantum goes, that I have no idea. But that's very interesting. I'd be curious. I'd be curious to know that as well. So.
If anyone else has any questions, something Kelley and I discussed a lot when we developed this is that we know this is a very personal topic. And so as she mentioned, please do feel free to email us if you don't feel comfortable, either sharing your perspective or asking a question. We're here for you, to support you. So I just wanted to put that out there as a reminder as well. And feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself if you do feel like asking a question or raising a concern.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.
No, I noticed there was a question, and I'm not sure if it was addressed about, is there a resource that looks at cultural activities and who's actually involved in cultural activities as I guess as a facet of prevention? Seem to be the the focus of the question. Was there some sort of listing or some way to find out who's engaged in, I guess, culturally appropriate prevention work?
Yes, and that's one of the things that I think that we have an opportunity to help with as far as building capacity. I know for the Cherokee Nation, a lot of tribes have websites, and you can go to these websites and you can communicate with your tribal leaders. And a lot of them have liaisons. I know that one way that we were trying to bring those cultural activities and knowledge into Albuquerque, which was a big urbanized area, was that we developed the New Mexico Cherokee community, and we were able to reach out and reach out to everyone that we knew, and word of mouth and census data to reach out to people to join this community through social media. And the leaders would bring in culture experts from the Cherokee Nation that would bring in drummers to learn how to drum, that would bring in storytellers, that would bring in beaters that would teach how to bead, or pottery that would learn how to make pottery. So there is a way to do it, but I think that that's an opportunity for where we can build capacity for this. What community structures are in place, or what can we create that could bring our elders or our culture keepers into a bigger urban community? I think that that's one reason that I do this, is to see, because there's pros and cons of each, and it's trying to merge those two together. So that's just one way that I know was done in Albuquerque. And so I'd be curious to know what other urban cities that would apply to. But what I can say now is that a lot of tribes have websites, and maybe you can start looking into community members that way. That's how I started doing it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't see any more questions from our audience, Kelley. So I just wanted to thank everybody for taking our time. We actually have a question quickly from Cynthia about funding. Perfect timing, Cynthia. Working in an urban area which is a tough area in Chicago. They say we represented over 165 different tribal nations. In that location, they brought together mainly woodland tribal teachers. Do you know if there are funds available to bring in more cultural presenters from around the country?
Grants. Sometimes tribes offer grants. Other than that, I'm not too familiar of funding opportunities as of yet. I am learning more and more about that as I go along. But I think that I do know that one of the ways that we're able to get the speakers in Albuquerque is we're able to apply for some grants, small grants, foundational grants. Some nonprofits offer some help as well, some NGOs. So that would be my only suggestion with that. But again, the funding isn't something that I'm familiar with on my end of the work at this point. That's a good question.
Honestly, thank you, Kelley. We could kind of ask our resident expert, Mark Clark, to step in if he wanted to offer some insight on that, as I know we have some experience here with NCUIH in that area. Mark, do you know if there's specific grants for cultural presenters?
I was just typing in the chat box that there's a challenge with organizing presentations in general when we talk about in-person gatherings. So that's sort of become a challenge. It's almost like a vacuum of gatherings lately, specifically due to COVID-19. So having said that, I think one of the ways in which resources are made available is through some of the collaborations that already exist. I'm thinking of like the chiefs in Seattle, for example, some standing and intertribal organizations that often straddle rural and urban areas as existing collaborations and networks that make available a kind of forum for gathering cultural work across tribal identity and across even geographies. So I think that's one idea that could be explored. So the transportation challenge is always there when it comes to, particularly around healthcare delivery. We're often struck with the barriers to good healthcare that is strictly related to the absence of good transportation networks and within not even at the neighborhood level sometimes, but particularly for travel back and forth from reservation to urban area. So transportation is a challenge in so many ways too. Not only the gathering of our folks, that would apply to our creative folks as well. The gathering of creators is taking place, I think, nowadays in some really interesting spaces virtually. So I think there's probably some creative resources that have been generated around this capacity to gather creators in that virtual space, and that's another avenue that's worth exploring. That's maybe more immediate than waiting for the end of travel barriers. I'm going to say a moratorium on large gatherings due to COVID-19. So that virtual space, relying on some of the intertribal organizations and collaborations that have been around for quite some time, that already exist, might be a good starting place to look for how to gather American Indian creators in one spot to look at how that can influence our interventions.
This is Sabu from NCUIH. Thank you all for joining us, but I want to add to Mark's and to answer Cynthia's question. I know that SAMHSA's Native Connections program has grants. Unfortunately, one that just passed, but there's another one that's due on April 20th. And they're more focused on a lot of the work that you're seeing today, right? Like this presentation and having Native folks come and speak on culturally focused topics that help Native communities across Indian country. So we could share that information for that grant that's due on the 20th of April, but also just looking at I think Mark mentioned it, like SAMHSA also has a Tribal Technical Assistance Center where they bring folks, they find like Native folks for urban communities to do like gathering of Native Americans and such to have presentations on topics that also might be helpful. So we could also pass that information on to y'all in a follow-up email.
Thank you, Mark and Sabu, for sharing your experience. I hope that answered your question, Cynthia. We'll just stick around for like another minute or so if anyone has any other concerns. But as Sabu said, we do have a follow-up email that goes out. So we'll have all those resources and information in there for you as well. Okay, I just want to say thank you again to Kelley for sharing with us your personal experience and also all your academic work that you put into this.
I just want to make one observation. I put a link in the chat box for the connection to SAMHSA's Native Connection grants. By following that link, you can get to the landing page that takes you to their section of the of the SAMHSA website that talks about the Native Connections program. So
Thank you, Mark.
and I put that in the chat box.
Awesome, and we'll add that to our resource list as well. So thank you everybody for joining. We hope to see you at future presentations, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.